Morning, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us for this brief elevator music interlude as our panelists exchanged mics. I'm very happy to announce the next panel, which is about the European political community, its challenges and opportunities. I hope we'll hear from the panelists about whether or not the vision after this meeting in Granada is clearer, whether it can actually be a facilitator for EU enlargement, even with so many non-EU members. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the panelists. So we will have Alexandre Adam, a member of the French Council of State and the former Europe advisor to French President Emmanuel Macron. Vessela Tcherneva, the Deputy Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations and the head of ECFR's Sofia office. We have Nick Heath, the head of Europe Strategy and Expertise Department in the UK government's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And we also have Alexandre Matas, the Director of International Security Dialogue Department at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. They will all be moderated by Isabelle Ioannides, who is a senior policy analyst from the European Parliament's Research Service. So please, panelists.
So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thanks to the organizers for having us and organizing this very topical discussion, which comes just a week after the Granada summit, where, if anything, we've seen that mediation and dialogue is very much needed still, but we've seen also how difficult it is. It's very difficult to talk about a specific positive outcome when we see that Turkey's Erdogan and Azerbaijan's Aliyev were not there. We've seen that Vučić and Osmani didn't talk to each other, but also there was an uneasiness to communicate whatever result, whatever came out of this discussion with 700 journalists just left hanging there. And everything comes at a moment. Obviously, this is a framework that was constructed at a moment of uneasiness after the Ukraine war. And this discomfort only got worse. Now we can have also, we have the Nagorno-Karabakh situation, we have the Israel-Palestine war. Things are only getting more difficult. And at the same time, it came at a moment where we were trying to understand what our capacities are to react to this. But is this yet another forum? What is new about this, and what is really the vision of it? So first, obviously, it makes sense to turn to you, Alexandre, because you worked for Emmanuel Macron, and this was his brainchild. He announced it at the European Parliament, actually, in 2022. And at the time, he talked about creating this strategic intimacy that would create a dialogue to discuss foreign policy issues and come to some sort of a common ground from a European perspective. And I'm wondering, has this evolved, and where are we today, and what was really behind this concept?
Thank you. Thank you. Really glad to be in Belgrade this morning and to have the opportunity to say a few words about the genesis of the EPC and the underlying ideas. First, there are two reasons, I would say, for making this proposal a year and a half ago. First one was obviously the new situation for the European order created by the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and the assessment that at this moment in time there was a governance vacuum in Europe to gather all European countries, whether they are a member of the EU or not. There was, in this respect, I think, a lesson learned from the EU Western Balkan Summit. I had the chance to just not an advisor, so attend those summits. And what was really striking is how asymmetrical those summits were. And during the summits, participants were supposed to discuss regional cooperation in the Western Balkans, how to foster it. Were supposed to discuss infrastructures, connectivity, migration, etc. But it was all about the EU. And it was all about the EU repeating the pledge that European perspective is real, and candidate countries blaming the EU for not keeping up the promise. And so in this framework, in a way, the EU was the polluting dimension of the talks. And so what we realized at this moment that there was a governance vacuum in the sense that there was not in Europe a political forum where all countries are on the same footing with an equal dignity, whether they're EU members or not. The second reason, or the third actually reason, it was the UK. It was Nick, but also all his fellow citizens. The fact that already in 2019, President Macron had proposed, we were in the middle of the negotiations of the withdrawal agreement, but proposed that at some point the UK be associated to the EU within a European Security Council, something like that. The idea being having the UK, or anchoring, if I may say, the UK in the European family, and have the UK expertise, the UK diplomacy, being part of the discussions on everything that is really of importance for all, for the European continent. So that was basically the main idea. If I want to say to focus on the objective, it's showing at this moment in time unity and solidarity towards Ukraine, and having a peace, stability, and security agenda. So maybe I'll stop here for now. I can elaborate on how we can assess Grenada and what's the way forward. I would say the genesis was really about that. Political forum, equal dignity, not being, discussions not being polluted by relationship with the EU. So in our mind, the EU is not at the center of all of this.
Okay, well, if I may turn to you then, Vessela, because clearly when this EPC was announced, there was a clear discomfort in this region. How does the EPC relate to the EU enlargement? Is it something that it can facilitate? Will it complicate things? Is it an alternative to EU enlargement? How do you see this situation? If we look at the Franco-German experts report that just came out on EU institutional reform, even there the EPC is presented as in their EU integration framework as the most outer, let's say, part of integration, which is quite uneasy. These are countries that could eventually be part of the EU, but they could also not be part of the EU. So if anything, it hasn't clarified what the relationship between EPC and EU enlargement is. What's your take on it?
This was one of the big questions when EPC happened for the first time, the summit in Prague, whether this would be kind of the alternative gathering on enlargement, which implicitly would basically carry the idea first that the enlargement has failed and that it cannot proceed, it cannot go further. And secondly, that there is a kind of a cunning plan done by people in Paris, Brussels, or elsewhere who, you know, think how to keep those countries out. And I really think this was not the case with EPC. And I know that some candidate countries have been thinking that and have even voiced those concerns. But in the meantime, I think it became clear that EPC is really much more a child of this geopolitical moment, a moment when Europeans, and here I totally agree that it's not about the EU in the center of it, it's a moment when Europeans look around and basically count, how many are the countries that feel worried about the war, that want to have an alternative forum on which they can freely discuss the issues that have come to the fore. A forum where France and UK can sit together without having any sort of disbalance in the relationship. A forum where small countries can have their limelight moment, can have their pictures taken with the leaders of kind of larger Europe, but also a forum where there can be unilateral agreements reached. Clearly, this was not a forum on enlargement. Yet, when we talk about enlargement, and I understand this has also been discussed at the panel last night, it is about the geopolitical momentum, right? So we discuss internally about the common agricultural policy, about the next financial framework, about the reform of the EU, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it is about what is the EU's ambition vis-a-vis its immediate neighbors. So the geopolitical motive that is driving the new conversation on enlargement is again, has again been borne by the war, the Russian war in Ukraine. And this is why I think those processes should, in a way, run in parallel, but they definitely do not need to interfere with one another. If you ask me about the paper, I think this is a bit the problem with this concept. The idea that everything is going to be quite orderly, that there will be first circle, second circle, third circle. From what I can tell, it's actually going to be much messier. Yes. There will be variable geometries, there will be coalitions on various issues. In some coalitions, it will be much more important to have the UK than to have others, or to have Switzerland than to have others. And if we now talk about the Middle East, to have Turkey. Actually, if we talk about the war in the Black Sea, we need to talk about Turkey as well. What I'm saying is that the world is becoming much more complex than some of us political scientists sometimes believe it to be when we write papers.
I don't know if you want to come in, Alexandra. I've seen you nodding a lot, no, because all of this actually very much looks like what Macron says, calls it, he talked about this multi-speed Europe approach, and it very much looks like that.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify. Multi-speed Europe and multi-tiers Europe are two different things. What I see in this Franco-German experts' reports is, and Vessela said it perfectly, too orderly way of seeing things. The idea that there would be an outer ring, a European outer ring, the EPC being the basis of this one, I just can't believe it, and I can't see the UK feeling extremely comfortable with the idea that it's outer of anything. If you ask Saturn whether it is comfortable with its orbit, I'm not sure that it's fine. I'm sure that Saturn considers that Jupiter is taking way too much room in the space, and Mercury is probably better, but it's a bit hot. So, trying to design things like this is just not corresponding to the reality, and I'm not sure that I can add anything else to what Vessela said perfectly. Multi-speed Europe is different, but it's an issue not of the wider Europe architecture, is it's a question for the EU itself and the integration within Europe. And we already have, as you know, a multi-speed Europe, not all EU member states being part of the Eurozone or Schengen, etc. For me, in this context of the enlargement today, multi-speed Europe is trying to answer to one question, or I would say a question being asked to candidate countries. Do you agree to the idea that when you join the EU, it's about an ever closer union? And for me, that is a question that we discussed with the Brit in 2015 and 16, and that I think is a valid question. When you join the EU, do you agree that this should be a further and further integration to a point that is not clear for anyone, that some think that it's about federalism. It's not my way of seeing things. But I think that it's a valid question. And in this regard, if you ask the question, I think that in the way that we anticipate the EU to develop, you might have some countries joining the EU that will be fine with the EU as it is at the moment they join, but not fine with the idea that it could further integrate.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pick your brains about another thing that I think you both mentioned, which is this equal footing in this forum. And I'm wondering, so this would therefore be an opportunity for the region, for the Western Balkans, to actually set priorities and say clearly what their goals are. And do you feel this has been done? What can be done differently? For example, I know there's these working streams where there's one member state and then a non-EU country coming and working together. So far, there is no such combination with a Western Balkan country, as far as I know. Is this something that could happen, or how would the Western Balkans actually put their foot down and set priorities in this context, which is quite populated, actually?
There are several working groups, and I think the Western Balkans can contribute to each and every one of them. I don't want to preempt anything that Nick would tell us, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the UK agenda for the EPC, but on issues like energy, on issues like connectivity, on issues like migration, which go far beyond kind of the EU borders, I think the Western Balkans not only have something to say, but they're crucial, actually, to some of them. We talk about the Balkan route of migration. We talk about energy diversification coming from the south. We talk about north-south connectivity more and more. All of that has very practical security implications also for the Western Balkans. And I really think this is a great opportunity for governments here in the region to come up with their ideas and to put their ideas on the table, because they have been complaining that they're put on the fence and they cannot participate in the making of policies. I think the EPC really offers the platform if there is ambition.
And I'll turn to the UK then. Some have actually talked about the UK's European comeback with its participation to the EPC. I don't want to freak you out with this. But
me or Nick?
Well, maybe you too, I don't know. I was thinking of Nick. And if we look at the Granada summit, I think for the UK it's been quite successful, because it managed in a side talk to discuss migration, although migration wasn't clearly on the agenda, and discuss with Albania, which it considers its main problem country, let's say, on migration. And it also got the offer to host the next EPC edition. So what is really the interest of the UK in this platform?
Well, let me start by saying it's great to be in Belgrade and great to be with all of you. we should also, I think, acknowledge that while we on this panel, I think, have quite a lot of knowledge, there's not a lot of clarity about the EPC, right? We are constructing the plane kind of as we're flying it. And while we shouldn't give the impression, I think, of certainty on any of these questions, and there's quite a wide variety of scenarios about where the EPC can go over the next few years, from greater institutionalization and certainty through to just stopping. And we should be realistic about that. So let's not pretend there's greater certainty than we can offer. I guess I want to contend that there are a couple of things that are unique about the EPC that are worth just bringing out for the audience. The first is that it is inclusive and comprehensive. So we've talked about the equal footing, but it's really also the only format that brings together the entire continent without Belarus and Russia. To have everyone from the leaders of Iceland to Armenia, to Spain, to Turkey, is quite unique. And it includes EU member states, it includes NATO members. It's a broad coalition. The second thing that is worth just acknowledging as well is it's at leader level. So the political capacity for decision making is there. It is, at a different level than foreign ministers or a finance minister, or lots of valuable work can be done at those levels, but there's something very geopolitical about having leaders from across the continent in one place. It's also got limitations, right? And as the UK, we're very realistic about that. There is no output from the meeting. There's no declaration, there's no conclusions, there's not a body of precedent that, shapes how many organizations work. And that makes it difficult to take issues from one meeting to the next. And it puts quite a lot of responsibility on the hosts of each meeting to drive an agenda, to shape an agenda and drive an agenda, candidly. And we've thought about whether things like a troika system could help improve connectivity between the different presidencies, so themes are picked up from one presidency to the next. I think that's something we want to come back to a bit in our own chairing of the EPC. But the reality is, it is not going to be a decision-making format. I think we should be realistic about that. I don't see it, on its current trajectory, it's not going to take decisions. It can, I think, set political direction, and it can set political ambition. So at 47, my suggestion is that we could see a world in which leaders start to set out what kind of continent we want to create over a 10, 15, 20-year horizon. Take energy security. You could see an ambition for some sort of European supergrid that sets up interconnection across the continent, right? Now, there's no money, there's no organizing principle, there's no legal framework to underpin it. So it's not as though the EPC is going to be the delivery mechanism for those things, but leaders, I think, can set. And of course, it is bigger than the EU. The EU is a critical part of it, of course. But take the Black Sea. That region has enormous potential for renewable energy and for energy interconnection. But someone's got to set a bit of direction on that. So there's a sort of direction-setting possibility for the EPC, I contend. The other thing that we haven't brought out that I just want to briefly mention is we see an awful lot of value in coalitions of interested parties beneath the level of 47. Not everything needs to be done with the entire EPC membership. On certain issues, you'll see groups coming together and making a difference. So you mentioned this meeting that my Prime Minister and Prime Minister Meloni of Italy co-chaired in Granada. The President of France was there. We're very pleased he was there. The President of the Commission was there. Prime Minister Rutte was there. Prime Minister Rama of Albania was there. It's a small meeting, but it started to set out some frameworks, a plan, 8 points, principles for how to tackle organized immigration crime, which is a pan-European challenge. So you can see worlds in which subgroups within the EPC start to think about that and start to take forward cooperation on certain issues as well. So don't need to do everything at 47 is, I guess, the final point I wanted to make.
And how does it help shape the UK's relationship with the region? Because after all, I mean, there are many other fora within which you can and you work with this region. So what's new there?
Well, I think there's two things. One is, we would say this, wouldn't we? But it's an important diversification of the European space, right? There's the intellectual problem the UK has with the academic report created by the French and German academics is the idea that the EU is at the center of European integration, right? Like that, we're never going to accept that as a principle, right? There are different planes of European cooperation. There is the EU, valuable for its members. There is NATO, which creates security in the European continent. There is the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the EPC is another diversification of that model that creates synergies and interrelationships and linkages that don't exist before. So that's one. The second thing, again, more prosaically, is it provides a platform for the British Prime Minister to engage with her or his counterparts across Europe. And if you sit in the EU and you go to European Council meetings, you have that opportunity every couple of months, right? If you're Britain or Switzerland or Norway or Turkey or a bunch of other non-EU member states, in the Balkans too, that opportunity to go and have bilateral meetings and have agendas with leaders, I think really is quite valuable. And I contend it's quite valuable for Balkan states as well, not just for countries like the UK. You know, when last week in Grenada, my Prime Minister met Vučić and Osmani, and we agreed a migration arrangement to do some work on communications about transit routes with the Serbian government at that meeting. You can do these things bilaterally, right, as well. And I think that has value for EU and non-EU member states, both.
Well, you mentioned two things that I want to follow up on, and maybe this way I can bring in Alexandra as well, which is, you said, this is a forum of Europeans, but we don't have Russia and Belarus. And this is very much a forum that defines itself as being interest-based and not normative-based. But in a way, it does have this European identity. It has clearly defined who the enemies are. So it's almost like unconsciously there is this normative identity issue, right? So I'm wondering, where is the place of values in this debate, if at all, and is it important? What do you think, Alexandra?
Well, thank you for this question, which is not very easy to address. I think in theory, we don't need to share same values to be able to cooperate. It makes it easier to cooperate if we're sharing the same values, but it's not a precondition for this. And probably one of the strengths of the EPC is that in this extremely polarized environment with a lack of dialogue, with all those channels of communication congested or blocked, there is still an opportunity to bring together this group of non-like-minded, because we need to agree that the EPC brings non-like-minded to the table, who don't necessarily share the same values, but, as you say, share the same interest. Share this interest, I think Alexandre mentioned, for peace, or maybe negative peace and stability in Europe. The question of managing migration is, of course, a shared interest. Questions of tackling transnational challenges such as organized crime. This is, again, an example of the common interest that basically can trigger cooperation and within the EPC also. And I wanted also to come back and link what every speaker said about a forum where equals can meet, and basically all these non-like-minded actors can contribute to setting the agenda, can contribute to the discussions. This is very much appreciated, especially on this high level. And Alexandre, I think you mentioned that it was created. There was no such format. well, there is this format, of course, in the OEC, which is blocked right now and polarized, so that's a very good opportunity to use it now. But I remember working for a few years on the OEC that there was a lot of enthusiasm, especially because of this possibility to discuss on equal footing in the early 90s in the OEC, coming, for instance, from Russia or from newly independent states at that time. So that is something I think that which is also very much appreciated in the EPC. So it's this opportunity, this platform, this forum that is President Macron put it for strategic dialogue on European continent, and I think that's a very important point. Now, if we discuss what is the purpose of gathering all those non-like-minded, immediate reaction to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the possibility to put Europe on its foot again, clearly, that is one of them. We discussed here the EU enlargement and issues related to this. I would challenge, can we also use EPC for more middle-term and long-term thinking in terms of finding common ground for potential future discussions on the contours of European security when the situation allows that? Probably EPC with its inclusive platform could be one of this of the spaces where this could be discussed. But again, right now it's too early. It's a talk shop. It's possibility to meet. It's to discuss, to brainstorm some ideas. But probably at some point, just this beautiful family photo will not be enough, and that EPC will need to demonstrate some impact.
Well, I think you've put a very concrete idea on the table, which is to use this as a diplomacy forum, purely. But as it is organized today, with all these side talks, let's say, trying to come to an agreement on very specific issues, you mentioned it, Nick. You have this idea, but then you don't have the institutional capacity or the budget that's needed to do something with this idea. So in the end, at least so far, it very much looks like a talk shop. And we do have enough of this fora around. And I think because of the different wars and the disorder that exists in the world, citizens need something concrete. I think they need to see action. And so many elections are coming up. I work in the European Parliament, so I'm particularly concerned about the elections in the European Parliament. Citizens want to see something concrete. So who will take over? You know, how can we delegate what's decided at the EPC to someone else to carry out? How do you make this, how do you move? I understand the value of the act of meeting, but is that enough? Who is going to deliver on what has been agreed upon? You want to take the question?
Yeah,
okay.
I would like to. No, I mean, this is an excellent remark and very important question, I think, because there's a question of the metrics. How do we assess that a summit is a success or not? And the metrics that we're used to is basically the white smoke in the EU, I mean, of having adopted European conclusions, European Council conclusions. If it's at 2 in the morning, it's fine. At 4, there must be division within the EU. Usually it goes that way. But the thing is that this way of seeing the value of leaders meeting, I think, is to a certain extent counterproductive, and this leads us wanting to have deliverables. But in a way, I think that looking each time for each summit to have deliverables will be disappointing. I've experienced, again, some summits, and at some point in the preparation of summits, you just open the drawers, and just look what did not work the previous times. Okay, let's try this time. And I'm sorry, but it's not really what the citizens are actually hoping for. So then it's about the question, indeed, is it more than a talking shop? Well, first, I'm convinced that at this point in time that it is a talking shop in this context is extremely, extremely valuable. Then what's next? One of the key aspects to me of the EPC is really the diplomatic part and the regional dialogue part. I'm convinced that in this framework, we can have discussions and presumably or hopefully progress on the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. That in this framework, maybe we can also have talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Turkey and Cyprus and Greece. But for this, you can't just wake up on the eve of the summit. And you need to really structure a diplomatic process over months and weeks so that at the moment that leaders meet, that is the ones who are democratically elected and who are entitled to take decisions, that at the moment they meet, the diplomatic, let's say, landscape or situation is mature enough so that actual decisions can be taken. And I think that really for the development of the EPC, preparation of the summits is really the key part. That's why I like the idea of trio or quatuor, not too many probably, but to ensure that you have a continuity between summits, but also that the teams in capitals that are in charge of organizing the summit, who are overwhelmed with work in every capital, and usually when you have a summit in 6 months, it seems to be extremely far away. So that really there's a continuity between summits, between the teams in charge of the organization, and so that diplomatic processes, sequences, we like to say in France, can be organized.
I'd love to hear from you, Alexandra, from your experience of working with other multilateral fora.
Well, thank you for this. Yeah, I wanted maybe right away to jump on this suggestion of the Troika structure. It seems what is missing right now is to bring the ideas out of those discussions in EPC is basically a capacity to synthesize the ideas that were raised in those informal discussions and then basically feed it back to the heads of state, right? Because we don't have institutionalization, because we don't have a secretariat. I understand there is some informal secretariat, but which is clearly not overwhelmed with work, as you said, Alexandre, and that's not its primary purpose. And here this idea of Troika, we cannot use it very practically. We can, for instance, have about 2-3 political analysts per country, per hosting country, so a group of 6 who could be there and who could be picking up ideas and then synthesizing them and preparing this report. And that would be something concrete, some concrete output that can come out of it. I don't believe that we need any heavy institutionalization of EPC. That is probably something that could help right now. That's one of the benefits of the advantages of the EPC, not to have this heavy institutionalization, because it allows it to be agile. It allows it to be less bureaucratic. But then what to do with those ideas that come up? We discussed it with our partners in the European Council on Foreign Affairs, and Nick was there also at the GCSP in my center a few weeks ago. And we were thinking about it that EPC is right now this inclusive, this agile ground for testing the ideas, but when there is more political support to implement those ideas, in this moment we need to link it to other multilateral institutions, be it NATO, be it EU. I can, of course, talk in more details on the OSCE, which is very close to my heart. And I think there can be a lot of good cooperation that could address this lack of institutionalization in the long term. I will be happy to give you more on this.
Nick?
Sorry, I just wanted to come in. I think I agree wholeheartedly with that. there's an opportunity for the EPC to sort of set some parameters that other organizations will actually take forward and develop. And, that is definitely a way this could work. I also just wanted to come back to your original point, which is that at some point, the EPC's got to show value to citizens. And it's got to have some sort of retail impact on people's lives. Especially since I'm just thinking about our own one and the budget and the expense, I'm also keen that we achieve that. I wanted to point to President Macron's comments in Grenada, where he started to map out a focus on youth and the sort of young people of the EPC. And there's a sort of world in which something is given to young people across the EPC. I'm not saying it's an sort of identity exactly, but there's an interesting idea there which could go forward or could not, depending on it. And then the more complicated thing, I think, just to air to others, is that a lot of the ways in which we think about this end up being what works in the EU and how could that be extended to the EPC, right? And there are a couple of problems with that. The first is, like who's going to pay for it? And if I was sitting in the Commission or in member states, I'd be slightly anxious about that. The second is who's going to organize it. And the third is kind of what are the implications of that cooperation? Because, if you're going to accept all sorts of legal frameworks and oversight from the European Court of Justice and so forth, it's going to get complicated for some of us. So it isn't straightforward to just start with what works within the EU and then can that work at 47. But there is clearly a model there as well. So I think my contention, I guess, is there are a variety of ways this goes, from tasking others through to a bit of a focus on what citizens across the EPC get, to thinking about it in terms of what works for the EU and what can work at 47 out. All are problematic, none are perfect, but there are potential directions there.
Maybe just as a way of also summing up what colleagues said, I think we need an idea what a success and what a failure would mean. And right now we're at a point where this question is basically becoming larger, simply because Grenada seemed to be a bit anticlimactic, by any definition, I think. So if we think about the London summit, or is it going to be in London?
I doubt very much in London.
Okay, so the UK summit.
Nice try.
I think there we would have to see some sort of movement, some sort of progress, and this is when we would really have to be able to define success. Clearly defining principles is good. I don't know how much that can really keep the imagination of people with regard to EPC very engaged. If we think about what is really worrying people in Europe right now, what is driving the elections in Poland, the elections in Austria, but also what is making people in Switzerland or in Turkey really worry about its migration. To me, this is the big topic where the EU is struggling as well internally. And in my mind, it will continue exactly for the reason that it's much larger of an issue. And weaponization of migration is something that has become part of our security reality. With everything that is happening also in the last days in the Middle East, we will probably start talking again about it with this kind of new connotation of terrorism, anti-terrorism, and so on and so forth. So maybe that would be one area where we could probably map some sort of common understanding, at least, and this microphone is going to fall off, of what is that the countries that participate in the EPC really worry about. Do they have the same perception about security threat vis-a-vis migration? And maybe then chart a way forward. But I really believe that there will be a make or break point on how we see the EPC, and it's going to come soon.
Will be interesting to see if it's in the
London.
UK.
No pressure.
Well, we have about 15 minutes left, so I wanted to see if we can bring in the audience in the discussion. Please introduce yourself at the beginning.
I'm Milica Delivic from European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I'd have two questions for Alexandre. The first is around this idea of a core, and the second is more around single market. So the idea of core Europe has been around for a fairly long time, and it has never materialized, which to me at least suggests that there might have been some reasons why this hasn't happened so far. So why do you think it will happen now? And what do you see as a core? If it's all of the Eurozone, we might end up with a rather big core, possibly only with Denmark outside of it. And the second question is single market. The idea of indivisibility of single market has been very central, especially during the Brexit negotiations. Now, looking at phasing in gradual integration for new members during the enlargement process, do you see this as unpicking single market? If yes, and with having read about your idea about gradual sectoral integration where countries can decide where they stop, would this also be open to countries like the UK or possibly Turkey? Thank you.
Maybe we can take a couple more questions. Serjan, and the gentleman back in the second row over there.
Okay, I didn't want to take the floor before our guest, but if he doesn't have a mic, I will ask quickly the question. So my name is Serjan Cvijic from the Belgrade Center for Security Policy. When the EPC was formed, it was a very positive moment because on the one hand we had Russia aggressing another sovereign nation, Ukraine, and we had this whole compact block of states. We had October 2022, where there was mediation achieved between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and then what we experienced lately, that actually members of the EPC can go to war against each other once again. So my question is, can we overcome what happened between Azerbaijan and Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh? And this is for all. You can pick and choose who wants to answer.
Right behind you.
My name is Reinhard Prieber. I've worked for quite a while for the European Commission. Thank you very much for this interesting insight into a new institution in Europe. If I understand well, there have been 3 summits up to now. Can anybody on the panel explain to me anything concrete having come out of one of these summits? And having raised this question, may I also make a remark? If one of the ideas, if I listened well, is to get for the Western Balkans more opportunities to talk or to raise their voice, I personally find this relatively dangerous. It looks very much as second best instead of advancing the enlargement. And secondly, if there is any idea that the UK needs some talking forum because they are no longer sitting in the European Council, then very frankly saying it was your choice. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can take this first round while the audience thinks of other questions. Alexandre, you had one that was directly posed to you.
No, but just start reacting to this. Yes, it was the UK choice to leave the EU. Does this mean that we should avoid talking to the Brits in any kind of European format? Sorry, it does not make sense, sir. No, but that really does not make sense. No, the thing that, no, but we'll try to explain. what I'm convinced is that the relationship between the UK and the EU will not be that easy, or will not have a kind of a new honeymoon as I read everywhere. I think that the Windsor Agreement and the Agreement on Horizon Europe were the top of the relationship. I'm pretty sure that every 6 months we will have spats between the UK and the EU when it will come to the end of some of the transition periods. I'm sure that in 26, when we'll discuss energy cooperation and fisheries, we will have some talks together. And so the relationship between the EU and the UK will remain a difficult one. That's why we need the EPC as well. Then on the idea of core Europe, the thing is that I mean, you are the core when you're looking from the place where you sit. So France is seeing itself in the core of Europe because we are part of all organization and all of the deepest tools of integration in the European Union. Is this, and so it's, in a way, I'm not sure how to answer the question. The question is whether we think that a small group of member states will further integrate, but also institutionally, whether there will be more transfers of competence in some new areas, but most of all, transfer of powers to centralized institutions. My feeling is that this way of thinking is over. But it's really, I'm speaking on my behalf. My feeling is that we won't integrate in an institutional capacity more than we have until now. And you are right, the Eurozone is, by way of the kind of powers that we have transferred to the EU, the most integrated part. That's true. But it's much more diverse than it used to be. I don't know if we will go until 26 or on, but we are now 20. And so the economic and social heterogeneity within the Eurozone is much stronger than it used to be. So I don't know whether this could be the basis of a stronger political integration, but I have my doubts. Then indivisibility of the 4 freedoms, and versus gradual integration. That's true that there's a kind of paradox between the EU stance during the Brexit negotiation and what not only us, but many experts and countries are contemplating today to make a process work, or a process that is not working today, the enlargement process, work. So there's a paradox. But there's also a difference between a country that is leaving the EU and countries that are wishing to join it, that at some point will be part of the 4 freedoms. We have had during the past enlargements also divisibility of the 4 freedoms. There were transition periods on the free movement of workers for not all countries, and the UK I think made a mistake not doing it at the time. No, I needed to do just one thing, not a critique of the UK. That is my daily quota. No, we have done this. And to be frank, I think that we will need to do it for the next enlargement as well, to have transition period for the free movement of workers. I think that with the demographic problem that we have in this region and in other regions, if we are not vigilant enough with this respect, we will create problems. And not for France. It's not a question of social dumping. It's a question of the demographics of this region. So that's why I think that, yes, in a way, gradual integration is a way forward. And on this, really, I would like, and as the Commission is represented here, I would like really to say that we need also the Commission to work on these ideas of gradual integration, because we have a process that is not working for many reasons, and we want to make it work. If you want to analyze what has changed in the French position regarding enlargement, it's not shifting from no to yes. It's how do we make it work. It's really this, and it's what President Macron said in Bratislava last May. It's not a question of if, it's not a question of when, the soonest as possible. It's a question of how. And the how, for me, it's gradual integration.
I'm sure you want to respond to the comment, but if someone could also take Serjan's question, which I think is very important. We have two members of the EPC now that are sitting on opposite sides, and how do we deal with this? Because some kind of consensus on the basics is necessary if we're going to come to agreement on bigger things, like the European order, security order that you mentioned.
Should I just go first? I mean, respectfully, sir, I see your point. I guess the EPC is not the EU, right? And indeed, so the point is, when at Grenada, my prime minister sat with, the president of Serbia and President Zelensky and a whole range of other leaders, it's not an EU question. It's about a forum at which leaders can meet. So, without disagreeing with you unnecessarily on the benefits or not of my country's sovereign decision, the point is it's just a different forum. It's just a different platform for that. In terms of your, I think, more challenging question about what was actually delivered by the format, I think that's a fair challenge. My suggestion is that after the first summit in Prague, where Europe came together and it excluded Russia and Bulgaria and set a new parameter that said this is the European... Belarus. Forgive me. That is quite a sort of... That is, although it's a presentational thing, it's quite a substantive thing as well for international diplomacy. But then if you look at beyond that at what individual countries have agreed in the margins, then I think there's something there to be looking at as well. So in Chisinau, the Moldovan government got roaming rights for its citizens across the EU. We've signed deals in Grenada with Bulgaria and with Serbia. We launched a negotiation with President von der Leyen on acceding to Frontex in Chisinau. There is something there about the opportunity for countries to kind of come together in small groups. We joined the North Sea Energy Cooperation again in Prague. So that's just my country, right? So there is something about having a moment where leaders come together and it creates system pressure to agree something. I'm not going to overstate that, but that would be my suggestion. And just briefly, but I'm more interested in what others think on Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think that is a very difficult question, basically, and I think it's sort of too soon to say. My suggestion to your question about normative values earlier was that respect for the UN Charter was a good place to start, and that Russia obviously was totally disregarding its obligations under the UN Charter and therefore was excluded by default, and the Belarus support for that, practical and moral, was a sort of non-starter. I don't know enough about Armenia and Azerbaijan to know how that maps onto that conflict. But I think clearly having two countries in hot conflict is more complicated than having people who have disagreements who can come together, as we talked about with this region or with Turkey and Cyprus and Greece as well. I defer.
Yes.
You want to? I can start. Well, I can start then. Well, I think I will combine both questions on basically what can be done to overcome conflict and what are the concrete outcomes of the summit by addressing it with a very direct comment that without political will of states, it is very difficult to achieve results. And what Nick said, EPC is a tool, as some multilateral organizations. It's a forum, it's a platform, it's a tool to address security issues, to address international relations issues. But if there is no political will and political commitment of the states to use those tools, they will not be used. So it's not the fault of UN. Now we say, where is UN in the conflict in Ukraine? Where is the OSCE? It's not the problem of those organizations. Those organizations have a fantastic toolbox on conflict management, on conflict prevention, conflict resolution. But when there is a political will which is missing, that is very important. And that's something that we're having right now at the EPC. There is a will, and I think that is something why we are also excited and discussing it in many forums right now, because we see there is a political will to use it. And it was used. There were, on the previous Science Agreement, also of deploying the EU missions, Moldova, Karabakh. Yes, this time President Aliyev and President Erdogan didn't come. Is it the fault of the EPC, or is it the lack of political will? Probably there was no desire to expose himself to all those discussions, already being present in New York after what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh and EPC. But again, it doesn't undermine the work and the potential added value of the forum like the EPC. Another thing what it achieved, and I think we all agree here, is basically to mobilize this support to create this anti-Russian alliance in Europe after the invasion. So that is another outcome, and also to bring people who maybe don't share the same values but have the same interests to the table. So that is very important. But again, there are a lot of informal dialogues that tend to fail if there is no political will, and we need to make sure, and I hope that the also support provided by President Macron, for instance, this impulse to the European political community will continue, and that could bring us to more tangible results in terms of the summit's outcomes.
Vessela?
I would probably turn the question around a little bit on the presence of Armenia and Azerbaijan in EPC. I would ask, would it harm if they would meet, in such a setting? And I think that clearly the answer would clearly be no, because I think in times like this, we just need to keep talking. And here as diplomats, I think we would all agree and subscribe to that. I would maybe come back to something Alexandra said at the beginning, that Kosovo-Serbia can also be a topic that could be discussed within the EPC format. So maybe if we can see some value added of having this forum for this discussion, I think this could be also one deliverable. In terms of Milica's question on the core versus the larger core, that's how I understood it. I think one issue where we would know probably what the core would be is how this whole discussion about the reform of the EU is going to look like. Who are going to be the countries who will be shaping the agenda on things like common agricultural policy, on cohesion policy, and so on. And while this is a technical issue, I still believe that the energy, who will be the countries who will have the energy and the initiative to go into these very difficult debates is going to be very significant. And this will constitute the core in a way. Last but not least, why do we ask the Western Balkans to have their voice heard within the EPC? Look, I think countries like North Macedonia or Albania have been great chairmanships of OSCE, have been good members of the UN Security Council. I mean, this is not a mono relationship here. It's not about the Western Balkans and the EU. It's actually much more than that. And the Western Balkans have a lot to contribute, and I think they should be encouraged to contribute to large debates.
Great. So we're...
sorry, maybe just to say thanks to Igor and to Sergeant also for organizing this, because I think this conference is also one instance where we can deprovincialize our debates here in the region. So really, thanks a lot for doing it.
Absolutely. We have officially run out of time, so I will not be able to give takeaways, but I think with our discussion, we have demonstrated the diplomatic need for this dialogue. But I still live with this discomfort of what to do concretely with this political will that there is to actually mobilize it and turn it into action, which is exactly what's needed today, especially in an order of disorder and of need for concrete results. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much, and thank you for the active participation.